Earlier this year, we released our first ever online blacksmithing course, Essential Blacksmith. It's a course that was designed and is intended to help anybody step into blacksmithing at the fundamental level and give them the skills they will need to move beyond the basics into real blacksmithing and making real projects. One of the things that compelled us from the beginning is the notion that this can enhance anybody's life, whether you've been in the trades for decades or whether you've never picked up any sort of a power tool. Whether you're young or old, whether you are a man or a woman, blacksmithing is a craft, a hobby, a compulsion that can enhance anybody's life. It has been really fun seeing a lot of people from all walks of life pick up this hobby and run with it. Just an inspiration, really. Now, an anvil and a forge are not common characteristics of most home shops, but actually it is a great home hobby. As we prepare to reopen this course in a few weeks, I'd like to share one of the clips from the introductory portion of the series with you. And Nate and I are agreed that this is the best content that we've ever produced in terms of video quality and in terms of the logical progression of the concepts that are presented. I don't know how we're ever going to beat it. If you have any interest in blacksmithing or think you might have an interest in blacksmithing, go to the website. You can get a free tool list, and perhaps more importantly, you can be alerted when we actually open this thing up in case you are ready to take that next step. This video that I'm going to share with you is from the introductory portion of our course, and it's dealing with what I have learned is the actual barrier to entry, the actual obstacle that has to be overcome if you're going to become a blacksmith. And it's not what you think. It's not your space, it's not how long you have been in the trades, it's not how old or how big or how young or whether you're a man or a woman. It's something completely different than that. You hold your hammer like this, thumb on the side, a loose grip. If you're squeezing that handle like you're trying to pinch it off, you're throwing away energy. So you get to where it's just it's hanging in your hand and it's comfortable and thumbs on the side until you get right down to some fine work. You might want to put the thumb on the back for some, just for some easy blows, but most of the time, like all the time, your thumb's on the side. A big part of forging with a hammer is regulating or controlling how hard you're hitting it. But how hard you're hitting it is not a function of changing the mechanics of the swing, except the distance. To hit it harder, you just raise it higher. So you get your shoulder more engaged, you get the upper part of your body more engaged and use some muscle groups, but it is traveling on the same arc. Whether it is a medium blow or a fine blow, or you're really getting with it, it's the same arc, only longer or shorter, if that makes sense. Now, I don't want you to overthink this, but part of hammering and accelerating down through the blow is a whipping motion that kind of resolves as it comes into contact with the anvil. Can you see that? It's kind of pivoting in the middle of your hand and being snapped into position. And that requires kind of a loose blow. As I think about this, I realize that on the upstroke, which is somewhat assisted by rebound, the hammer could almost fly out of my hand. I'm not even worrying about squeezing that, except just enough to lift my arm. It's interesting that if you don't think about lifting the hammer, but just think about lifting your arm, the hammer is going to come with it. All of that being said, and all of that being true in a standard hammering condition, there are zillions of ways you're going to have to learn to use this hammer at this anvil. Zillions of ways that you'll find yourself hammering out of position. But the fundamental aspects of a good stance, a regular cadence, accelerating the blow, those things are all sort of consistent. But I want to give you permission to do whatever you have to do. For instance, when you're working on the side of the horn, that's out of position, but you can still snap it. If you are sort of dragging some material or working a bend out over the side of the anvil, you can use a pushing motion. So not only are you forging down, but the face of the hammer is dragging the material as it makes contact. An ordinary hammer blow at the face of an anvil is called a full face hammer blow. Full face of the hammer on the face of the anvil. Another type of hammer blow that you're going to be using periodically in the course, including in your very first project, is a half blow or a half face blow. That's where half the face of the hammer is on top of the anvil and half the face of the hammer is hanging off the edge, like this. I also refer to this as setting down the piece. And that implies the fact that you're shearing part of the work by the side of the anvil and pressing it down rather than forging it in any particular direction. The primary thing that your tong hand has to do is hold the work still. I mean, it's hard enough to hit the same spot twice with a hammer. It's impossible to hit the right spot with your hammer if you're shooting for a moving target. So in order to keep the work stationary, there's a couple things you can think about. One of them is you got to squeeze your tongs, okay? Now, no harder than you have to, but you have to be ready to have a grip on those things. Another one is down pressure on your anvil is important. So when that thing bounces around, you need to be holding down. You're not just holding it where it goes, but when it is in its right place, you're holding some down pressure. That also kind of gives you a bit of a three-point stance. Can you see that? I mean, you got your feet apart, you got your hammer, and you're pushing down on the anvil, which kind of keeps you stationary. You can also brace that tong hand against your hip. So now, you know, you're stationary here, you're stationary here, you're stationary on the ground. Maybe you have your knee up against your anvil block, and can you see that that becomes a very regular and predictable way to hammer? So really the only tricky thing about using a set of tongs is sometimes you have to be able to spin them without dropping the piece on the ground. That takes a little practice, and you can let it rub against your hip a little bit to help keep them closed as it comes around. Now there's another thing about tongs, and that is you're working along and maybe it's time to punch. Don't be afraid to drop them on the floor. Tongs don't mind. You don't have to be looking for a place to set them down when it's time to grab the next piece and go to your next operation on the anvil. So hammers and tongs, I mean, we would not have civilization without them. I have seen a lot of excited people get into blacksmithing. And I've seen a lot of those excited people get out of blacksmithing. And the reason that people do not pursue their dreams with blacksmithing is always the same. The reason is this: they did not have a realistic expectation of their ability to hammer. Don't let this happen to you. We're going to explain to you very clearly how you can learn to hammer like a blacksmith. Hammering's a funny thing, because how much more basic can a function be? I mean, it's like shoveling, right? I mean, how bad can it be? And that's the assumption we make. But the fact is, there's a lot more going on when you're hammering than you are thinking of if you haven't hammered, and there's more going on in hammering than you're thinking of once you've learned to hammer. Because a certain amount of this becomes reflexive muscle memory and eye-hand coordination. Much more than strength. Now, blacksmiths are sort of mythologized as being almost supernaturally strong. You know, under the spreading chestnut tree, the blacksmith and a large and mighty man. Yeah. But the fact is, anybody can learn to hammer, because more than strength, it's about coordination and practice. The practice is the key. There's no shortcut. The only way to learn to hammer is to hammer. But not all of your hammering has to be done at an anvil with a hot piece of steel. You can practice your hammering driving nails into wood. There are more things going on driving a nail, perhaps, than forging iron, because you have to regulate the attitude of the face of the hammer relative to the head of the nail so the nail doesn't bend. And so you get an instant biofeedback about, whoops, that was wrong because that nail just bent over. So if you have the self-discipline to practice hammering so that you can become a blacksmith, do it with a hammer and a set of nails. Grab, I don't know, pick a number. Let's start with 10 pounds of 8-penny nails, and let's drive them in. And let's don't worry about bending them over, but let's notice that you will bend fewer and fewer and fewer, and that the number of blows it takes to put it in will decrease until you walk up to a nail with some confidence that I'm going to put that thing in. And right then, you're going to know the quality of your blacksmithing is going to go up. Let me tell you a story. Young man in his prime, smart. When I say smart, imagine it written with a capital S. This kid grew up with a MIG gun in one hand and a cutting torch in the other, and a milling machine and a lathe, and everything he needed to learn to be a fabricator and a machinist was at his fingertips. And boy, he learned it. And he's got a great art sense. He designs the most elaborate fantasy motorcycles you ever saw, and he builds them from the ground, and they're beautiful. And when he saw artist blacksmithing, he thought, I can do this. And he came at it with gusto. And he built a power hammer, and he set up a shop, and he dove in, and he couldn't figure out why everything just didn't look good. And it was so offensive to him because he knew how to make beautiful things that when he would blacksmith something, it didn't look good. Not only did it not look good, but it looked bad, that at some point he just stepped back, and he still got it, but it's not in the center of his focus anymore, and frankly, he does not get satisfaction out of it. He hadn't learned how to hammer. So when I think back on the people that I have seen come with this enthusiasm to blacksmithing and then too soon lose that enthusiasm and quit, it can all be traced to a particular moment. And that moment is this. They've made a few things. They've forged a few things. They've been into the forge and onto the anvil and into the forge and onto the anvil a few times. And every time when they're done, they look at the piece and it does not look like what they were imagining. It doesn't look like what they wanted. In fact, it doesn't look great at all. And they finally get so disappointed, they can't figure out what in the world is stopping them from making things of beauty, and they walk away. And they were right on the very cusp of solving this barrier to entry that exists for everyone coming to blacksmithing, and that is, the problem was always their inability to control the hammer. Not their inability to hit, their inability to control where they were hitting. So when you confront that moment and you think, man, this does not look like what I wanted it to look like, don't think it's because you don't understand design, although you may not. Don't think it's because you put the bend in the wrong place, even though you may have put the bend in the wrong place. The real answer is because you haven't learned to hammer yet, but you will. If you keep at it, that arm is going to learn how to hammer, and when that happens, your brain is freed up, and now the design issues and the bending places and all those things happen as a result of your focused energy, and the arm does its good work, and the hammer responds to your wishes. So now here is the other story. On the other end of this scale of victory over hammering scale. So Sai's got a couple young apprentices. We'll call them apprentices. But they're students, really, and they come to his shop every week. And they're young. When they started, they were 12, and I think they're 13 now. And one of them, when he started, he weighed 80 pounds. And he's up to a whopping 85 pounds right now. But that young man had the drive. He had the fire in the belly. And so one of the first things that Sai told him and his dad was, this kid needs to learn how to hammer, because you could give him a little hammer, and Sai said he could put his thumb on the anvil, and if the kid would have hit his thumb, which was an open question, it wouldn't have been hard enough to hurt him. Couldn't hammer. That's a frustration. So sent him home with instructions to get a box of 8-penny nails and a stump and drive those nails into that stump. Learn how to do this. The dad came back and said he's doing it religiously. Every night after school, every night, that little guy would go out there and just thrash the top of that stump, driving those nails in. So now that little guy, and he still is a little guy, he's up to 85 pounds, humiliates the iron. He can pick up a 4-pound hammer. This is a 4-pound hammer. And he goes after that steel with a vengeance. And so he's no longer just an 85-pound kid. He's an 85-pound blacksmith because he practiced and he learned it. And now he can move on and learn the other aspects of the craft that really fuel his imagination and his passion. If he can do this, you can do this. The kid in the story about hammering was Taylor. Taylor is a great kid. Taylor wouldn't say quit. And that is one of the things that makes Sai just enjoy working with him so much. He's got no quit in him. Now, I am not a good friend of Taylor's. I'm a good friend of Sai's. But just watching this kid work with that old man makes me think that he probably enjoys it at least as much as Sai does. if you would have seen this kid, what, a year and a half ago, maybe, yeah, probably a year and a half ago, when he first stepped up to an anvil to try to forge something, you just wouldn't believe it was the same guy measured by what was coming off the anvil. The impact he was making with the hammer and the control and the creativity and the forging processes that he's learned. So, attaboy, Taylor, and good job, Si. You guys are doing a good thing. I hope you keep it up. I hope you've enjoyed this little peek into the course, and if you are interested, we are going to have coming up over the next few weeks some film clips that have been sent to us by people who have taken the course. It's interesting to see them and hear their stories and get acquainted with their process. So go to the website, keep an eye on that. You'll be able to access all of that information from there. If you are a regular viewer of the channel, you know that I've been concentrating really hard on the spec house now for, 3 or 4 months. And for those 3 or 4 months, the only time I come into the shop is to drop off a tool or pick up a tool or fix a tool or run the table saw. The blacksmith shop has just been used as sort of a storage depot for the construction effort. And that is all right, but I'll tell you what, I am excited at the prospect of getting that house dried in so I can get back into the shop when the rain starts to fall and the weather cools off, because there is no place that is better on a winter day than in a blacksmith shop. So I'm counting down the weeks. I'm trying to get that house done to the point that I can step away from it for a while and get back in here and forge something that is creative and took some determination and will last a good long time. So let me wrap this up by saying I appreciate the fact that you're hanging with us. And whether or not blacksmithing is important to you or you have any interest in it at all, I just appreciate the fact that you are part of what we're doing here, and the feedback that we get from you and the support that we get from you is something that we just couldn't live without in this social media adventure. So, like always, thank you for watching Essential Craftsman, and keep up the good work.